Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. I'm very honoured to have my guest today, who's probably one of the most qualified people I've had on here so far. Just to rattle off a bit of what she's done or doing. She is the Associate Dean at the University of Waikato. She's the author of multiple books, the co-primary investigator on the International Olympic Committee Advanced Research Grant, the manager of University of Waikato SIF Home of Cycling Research, and the co-founder of Fuel Aotearoa. I'd like to welcome Professor Holly Thorpe.
Thanks for having me.
It's all right. Thanks for coming on.
A few of those credentials are a little bit outdated now, but that's all right.
It's all right. It's about what you've done and what you have done.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And
Thanks,
obviously
Chris.
that's just scratching the surface. I'm sure there's heaps of other stuff you've done as well. So first of all, just starting off with how you got into sports. Have you always been a sports nerd, or was it something that...
Sports nut. That's one way to describe me, thanks. I grew up in a pretty active family in Gisborne and Tairāwhiti.
Yep.
My parents were always into the more alternative type sports. So
Right.
My parents were pretty passionate windsurfers. And this is back in the 80s now, telling my age. But whenever the wind was blowing, basically we wouldn't go to school. They'd throw us into the VW Beetle and off we'd go to the beach.
Yep.
And they'd pitch us up a little pup tent and off they'd go windsurfing. And we had a whole little community of other little kids who would be hanging out, checking out the rock pools. We had this whole little life going when the wind would blow.
Yep.
So this was my first sort of introduction into these alternative lifestyle sport cultures and communities.
Yep.
And as my life went on, I got involved in lots of other sports. Tennis, ballet was a big thing in my early days. Ended up getting into a lot of track and field, triple jump, tennis for a while. So did all those sports in high school. And growing up in Gisborne, surfing and skateboarding were always around.
Yep.
And I really enjoyed those sports, but I never really felt like I belonged. This is different gender relations back in those sports then.
How old are we talking?
Oh, this is in my teenage years.
Oh, yep.
Yep. So during this time, I loved PE. I loved studying the moving body.
Yep.
And this is what basically took me to Otago University, where I did my degree in physical education. And there we got a very cool foundation in like anatomy, kinesiology, psychology, sociology, history, ethics, philosophy, biomechanics, all these different ways of knowing sport and physical activity. And then it was while I was in Dunedin that I got pretty passionate about snowboarding. And for me, this was a sport that was really different. I thought at the time, really different to sports I'd done in the past. It was different to skateboarding. It was different to surfing, where the gender relations were often you're made to feel kind of on the outskirts, like you weren't supposed to be doing those sports, although we did it anyway. But in snowboarding, I felt like, it was expensive, and we found ways around that to try to do it as cheaply as possible with students. But I was able to do it alongside my male friends. And I loved that we'd go riding and there'd be girls and boys and we could learn off each other. And there's a different gender dynamic to that for me.
Yep.
And this ended up combining the studies with this interest in what was going on in the gender relations in snowboarding. This kind of new sport, right? It was newer than any of these sports, developed in the 80s, 70s, 80s. And so it was this kind of curiosity that ended up leading to my research and my PhD in this area, where I was studying snowboarding as this sort of global phenomena around the world, but also the gender relations in that.
How difficult is it to learn snowboarding compared to, say, skiing? Because I've tried skiing and I was terrible at it. And people told me, well, skiing's actually easier than snowboarding.
Yeah, so I used to... I was so passionate about snowboarding back in these days that I ended up doing 8 back-to-back winters between New Zealand and the States, where I was, I started off instructing snowboarding there, and then competing in New Zealand. So I did a lot of instructing, and while I was there, I'd get paid a little bit more per hour if I could also cross over with ski instructing. Right. Not that I'd ever been a skier, right? But so I did teach kids skiing, and I'd have to be standing there in my snowboard boots teaching them, because these were little kids, and it was basically pizza, spaghetti,
right.
go, stop, right?
Yep.
So they say that children at younger ages, it's easier to learn how to ski because of that parallel kind of balance, whereas snowboarding is on the side. But I'd say that's pretty different now with lots of kids growing up on skateboards, etc. Skateboards are pretty common around the around our communities these days, and lots of kids have access from quite a young age.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on your past experience with sporting activities and balance and coordination. Not saying anything there, Reese, but...
Well, hey, just last week I learned how to ride a bike, so...
Okay, well done. Congratulations.
Yeah. I never learnt when I was younger, so this is a new thing for me. So balance is probably hasn't been my forte for a long time.
Yeah, so basically, though, coming back to your first question, it has been a passion for sports, a wide variety of sports, but particularly those alternative sports, surfing, skateboarding, snowboarding, these sports that have grown and changed really, really quickly over the last 3 decades, that they went from really marginalised sports, basically being, people would, frown their nose at the skateboarder on the street,
that's right.
the snowboarders on the slopes, to now being Olympic sports. So we've seen rapid growth, rapid change. Basically, these sports are very much crossing over with, fashion, popular culture, technology development. So as a sociologist, these trends and the quick pace of change has been fascinating.
Oh, okay. So when you say sociologist, can you just explain exactly what that is? Because a lot of people will be like, what is that?
Yeah.
Because one of your main expertise is sports sociology.
Yep, sociology is my thing, and a lot of people, you're right, don't have any idea what sociology is. I had someone ask me, that kind of like psychology. And actually, it's quite a good comparison, right? So psychology, typically, there's lots of different strands of psychology, but we could say we zoom into the individual.
Yeah.
Sociology, if we've got a camera lens, imagine a camera lens with a big zoom.
Yep.
Psychology might be zooming into the individual. Sociology zooming right out to see a bigger picture beyond the individual. So what are the different social forces, the social structures that enable or constrain our lives in lots of different ways? So historically in sociology, we're interested in the isms, right?
Yeah.
Racism, classism, sexism, etc., where these big social structures and press upon our individual lives.
Okay.
But because I'm looking particularly at sporting cultures, it's often the same types of questions, where bigger social trends in sport.
When you're doing sociology though, is it looking at psychology as well? Yeah, they're both intertwined.
Yeah,
in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. So for me, I'm really interested in individuals' experiences. So yeah, we definitely do zoom in, but then we get to that kind of those ways of knowing through interviews or focus groups or media analysis or observations. And then again, pulling out to see what's the bigger picture here across individuals. So what are the broad social trends and themes that we're seeing here? So
when you're doing your research, how do you conduct your research? What are the things that you do when you're doing this research?
So there's a process to doing research, right? And it depends on what the project is that will decide your methods to answer those questions.
Yeah.
And obviously our questions don't come from nowhere. So we have particular kinds of theories or things that we're interested in that then encourage us to ask particular types of questions.
Okay.
And then when we ask those types of questions, we're like, how do we answer that question?
Yeah.
And it will depend on the topic, the community that you're working with.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So... where's an example? Right now I have a project with a PhD student of mine on the experiences of Muslim girls and women in sport in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Oh, okay.
So right now I've just had a meeting with her actually. So you can't just walk into that community and ask those questions, right? And I can't do that. So my PhD student, Nita, is a Muslim woman herself. So she's the best person positioned to do those interviews. But obviously it has to be done in a culturally appropriate way, that we've got to create safe spaces. How do you make sure the invitation gets to the right people? So often in research you have a lot of gatekeepers that you've got to try to get through to actually...
really? Who are the gatekeepers?
In this project, we've got to get through the Muslim community, but we've also got to get through sports organisations in New Zealand to try to get the word out. Yep. So there's lots of... As a sociologist, I'm really interested in methodology, right? How do we get to our participants? Then what's our relationship as a researcher and working with those participants? So it's not just about, capturing their voice and making it data and then publishing it, right? I tend to adopt a feminist approach, which means about respecting our participants and finding ways to change the power structures, because as a researcher, you kind of have have power in a sense, right? And you have to respect your participants and make sure they understand the research process. They know their rights, how you write it up. Sometimes researchers can write things up in ways. If you go back to the early anthropologists, the ways they wrote up these communities that they'd go in and study.
Yeah.
So we've got to be.
Have you ever seen another researcher though that's published something and then you study it and you're like, I'm not sure if I agree with that.
Yeah, well, that's the research process, right? And that's more general. And basically, we have to read everything we possibly can on a topic, and we'd probably. But there's a difference between. We don't always agree with it.
Yeah,
right?
like you can look at something and read it, but then it's different when you're out in the field and you're actually physically there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see something that's been published, a project that we can go, that was a really interesting approach that might have worked in that context, but here in Aotearoa in New Zealand, that's not how we do research.
Yeah.
Or, often as researchers, we do need to see the gaps in research that's been done, also the limitations in what's been done, so that our work builds upon and extends that.
Have you, because I know you've done research in other countries as well, haven't you? Mm-hmm. Is there a correlation you might find between New Zealand and, say, another country, or do you often find that it's completely different?
In terms of doing research?
Yeah, or like you find that the research you do, it turns out totally different when you're dealing with a different culture and different ethnic groups, yeah?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing of, you can't just drop into another country or another culture as a researcher and do a quick visit and get out of there. You've got to,
because you know how like some people will just try and apply one thing to like the entire world. This is something, and this applies to everything.
So we can pull back and see broader social trends, but if we're not paying attention to national differences and cultural differences, we're making a big mistake there.
Right.
And so as a sociologist, before I'd go anywhere to do research, I've done work in Afghanistan and Gaza and places like that, and you have to spend a long time doing a lot of reading, educating yourself about these contexts.
When you say long time, how long are we talking? Like months, years?
Yeah, months and months.
Yep.
Yeah, and that goes on, and you're constantly reading and learning more.
Okay, so you're constantly updating the information.
Because some of these contexts are changing pretty quickly too.
Yeah? So could you do like a research on something and then a year later it's totally changed?
Well, my work in Gaza has, it started in 2013.
Yeah.
The project has evolved and changed, but through that project, it's changed radically.
Have you changed a lot, though, from doing this research?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. If we were staying the same, it'd be what a boring job that would be.
Yeah,
that's actually what I love the most about my job, is that our topics can, you need a linear path through your topics.
Yeah.
But you become passionate about something else, or you see a major gap, and we can kind of navigate some interesting paths. And if we were still doing the same thing 10, 15 years later, I think we'd be getting pretty bored.
Yeah.
But the more and more you get into the research, the more and more you realise that there's such gaps, and you become you gain confidence, and you know that you can do that.
Because when you travel, it's good for enhancing the mind, and you learn about another culture. And in particularly your case, obviously, you're spending quite a bit of time with these people. So I'd imagine it would probably deeply affect you and change you in many ways.
Definitely.
Because they do say traveling enhances the mind. I mean, every time I travel, I feel like I've come back a different person.
Yes, that's good. There's there's whole areas on tourism studies, right? Critical tourism studies, where there's lots of different ways to travel too, where some people go to places and they take the snapshot and they go and do that experience, and they consume it, rather than spending time.
Well, which is what I prefer.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways and some forms of travel are pretty problematic in terms of, ways of consuming a local culture.
Do you go away and then come back to New Zealand and appreciate it more? Or are there things that annoy you? Or is it a combination of both?
I'm always very happy to come home.
Yeah, always.
I think there's a big world out there. Often,
it is.
Often people in the rest of the world think we're a long, long way away. And every time I come home, I feel very grateful.
Yeah.
To call Aotearoa home.
Yeah. Okay. And so with your research, do you find that socially people, because what I've noticed is there's some people around that particularly if you're introverted, and these days with the internet and technology, people are communicating a lot through digital means, like a phone or Facebook or whatever. And I think you lose that ability to socialize and have a social conversation. Do you find that with sports? Because obviously people are working often together, not all sports, but say with rugby or football or something. Do you find that people are more social as a result of that? Or even with action sports, like say snowboarding or anything, but even though can be a solo thing.
Yeah.
But you often meet other people that are into the same thing that you are.
Yeah, no, that's been something that's changed over the time of doing research.
Right.
When I started studying these sporting cultures, the internet was only kind of becoming a thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you started having some websites for these sporting magazines, and they'd have these kind of forums for different conversations. But that's changed so radically. And actually, that was a big part of one of my previous books, was around how young people are using social media to connect and to these sort of imagined communities and these transnational flows of knowledge and ideas. But it's not just like you're sitting in your room doing this.
Yeah.
It's actually how that intersects with these physical moving cultures. And I think lots of people have this kind of idea that you're doing one or the other. And in sports, there's, in health discourse, often like young people and social media and video games, and these are all, keeping them from doing physical activities. But what I was actually really interested in seeing is if you go to a skate park, or often it goes hand in hand, the filming of these activities. So often you've got your phone to organise meeting up with people at the skate park, then you're there and you're filming each other. Often they'd go home and make their own little videos and share those with their international sort of skate community, get feedback, watch other videos, get inspiration. Next day, go out skating, try some new moves, use your phone to connect with other people. So actually it's not passive, physically active. It's actually, I'm really interested in how these two interweave.
Right.
And so that was... some of the early work. And actually more recently, I've had a cool project with some colleagues in Australia around women who use social media for physical activity and the whole... Like organising events? Yeah, that's part of it. But actually we've been really interested in... have you heard of Fitspiration?
No. So what is it?
So basically it's this whole social media phenomena of
I'm going to write that down.
Fitness influencers, right? Yep. So they have their own sort of programs. You can buy the programs, you do the programs, you post the selfie of yourself, meeting your goals, your before and after photos, there's body transformation photos. This is what I was like before. Look, I'm getting better. You get a support network around you of people saying, hey, well done. You're doing so well. Keep at it. So it's very interesting how these digital communities are operating alongside the physical practices.
Right, which is one of the cool things.
It's pretty fascinating, I must say, yeah.
What is your thought on the phenomenon of like esports, which has become like this big massive thing? Yeah. I've got actually a recruiter from the New Zealand Army coming on, and I'm actually interested to ask them if the New Zealand Army has been affected by esports and if people are less physical than they were before, because I'm not sure if you know about the recent Fortnite World Tournament where the winner won like $4 million, which is more than some physical athletes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if that would dissuade people from, partaking in more physical sports and, I'll just do esports because it's just this.
Yeah, well, there's lots of arguments that say that is it a sport or is it not a sport? And some of those elite athletes are doing quite a lot of physical training to be in that peak condition. And that's not an area of research for me, but the University of Waikato have an esports whole area of expertise developing now, which is pretty interesting. They have esports scholarships for students.
Do you have students that you have that are both physical and esports enthusiasts, or are they usually one or the other?
I can't comment on that, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think those that take esports pretty seriously are spending a lot of time.
Well, you'd probably
doing it.
You'd have to invest all your time into one space, I suppose.
But I was really interested. Last year, I was at the Olympism in Action Forum in Buenos Aires, which was a big 2-day conference. I was presenting there on the urbanisation of sports and what this means for sort of trends in sport. But at this 2-day conference, there were sports leaders from all around the world, the president of the IOC there, and there were heaps of sessions on esports. And a lot of the traditional sports organizations, whether it's swimming or gymnastics or, et cetera,
Yeah.
are feeling quite uncomfortable about this move towards esports, because the Olympics is basically working through the motions to get esports into the Olympics.
Really? Esports in the Olympics?
Well, it's complicated. It's a complicated process. And Thomas Bach, the president of the IOC, some of his major concerns are around the violence in some of these games and the gender. Because in some of these communities, women get quite marginalised.
Oh, yeah.
And the treatment of women's not great. So
No.
to go into the Olympics, that's not the kinds of sports they want. But they do want to tap into this huge
It's a huge market.
Huge community, huge market. And then we get into all the virtual sports, and there's just this, sports is changing so fast. So as a sociologist, all of this is just fascinating stuff.
Oh, okay. So you primarily deal, you've studied like fitness health for females. So what's some of the stuff you've come away from doing this research in terms of how the female body works in regards to the male body?
Okay, that's kind of different. In
terms of how it's responding, because you did mention in your lecture that I went and saw that females, and I think, what was the name of it? There's something that
Red S?
Yes.
Okay, so, let's flip a little bit. This is a project that I've had going on for 7 or 8 years now, on female athletes and female exercises, and a condition called Red S, which stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport.
That's right.
There you go. And the other acronym related to that is LEA, which is low energy availability.
Okay.
So this is a condition that used to be thought of as only happening in elite female athletes when they're not quite getting enough energy coming in. So they're not quite fueling, the nutrition's not quite covering the energy being burned in training, etc. So it used to be called the female athlete triad. And that's just some sort of conditions associated with this were bone health, so bone mineral density, osteoporosis risks, stress fractures, disordered eating practices, and then menstrual cycle changes because of all these kind of hormonal shifts.
Right.
But what they're recognizing is that it's not just affecting female athletes, it's affecting male athletes too. So not the menstrual cycle, obviously, but their health. So we've got sports where men are not getting enough calories in to cover their training going out. And when that happens over a chronic period of time, can be really bad for your health.
Is there any statistics that show what those people are eating or drinking? Is there a link in terms of stuff that they're not?
So it's not necessarily what, it's the quantity.
Right.
And so this is a condition that affects basically all of the health systems of the body. So your stomach, your gut, your hormones, your bones, your heart, cardiovascular health, affects your psychology. So what I've been really interested in is how our research can understand these complexities. And there's been a bunch of research on this, which has been mostly from the physiological side. But at the University of Waikato, I've been working with a team, including Dr. Stacey Sims, who's a leading physiologist of female athletes, women's health. And we've designed a methodology that has looked at this issue across 3 different sporting cultures. So with women triathletes in Ironman distance, so pretty serious athletes in an endurance sport that they train really long hours. They're often very, very lean, often quite restricted diets. Very, very, really carefully monitoring their diet. As well as really long distances of training. And then the women's rugby sevens team. So obviously a very different sporting culture. It's a team sport. It's based on speed and strength. And they have a wraparound support structure, right? Because they've been doing so well internationally. They have the nutritionist working with them. They have the team physios. And then we've been doing it with female weightlifters. So that's a very different sporting culture again, where it's about strength, but often there's weight restrictions. And so there's a lot of quite severe kind of dietary practices to get into a weight category. So obviously different types of bodies, different types of sporting cultures, different types of sporting structures. And particularly in the Rugby Sevens one, we've been working with nutritionists from Otago. And part of that methodology is the athletes take photos of every meal.
Oh.
And that gets sent down to the team at Otago, where they are calculating their calories alongside their training to make sure the nutrition is covering what's required. And this is a longitudinal project leading all the way up to Tokyo next year.
Okay. So when did this start?
This started at the beginning of last year.
Okay, wow. Okay, so it's quite
So they're not doing this all the way through, but at different phases.
Different phases through the course of it.
So yeah, come back to your question originally. It's not necessarily what they're eating.
But the quantity.
But yeah, to making sure it's covering the energy being expended in their training, because these athletes are doing some serious loads.
Is this on the rise though? Is this becoming...
The condition is becoming increasingly common.
Yeah.
And it used to be thought of as only being in sort of those sports where women were very, very thin. So say ballet or gymnastics or figure skating, where they actually got judged on what they look like.
Yeah.
And female gymnasts, as soon as you develop hips, your rotations slow down. So there's types of sports. It is really, really common.
Okay.
And also in running sports, where women are running, athletes are running really long distances.
Yeah.
But what they're recognizing, it's happening across a range of sports now, team sports, rugby, etc. So yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of research happening, and increasing prevalence. And our research is trying to recognize how these social, psychological considerations, sporting cultures, as well as the physiology are kind of intersecting, because none of the research has been doing that already yet. So that's kind of a world first in that area. But
so are you very hands-on with that research? Are you physically there?
So I lead the interviews.
Yeah.
But I'm not the person doing the other methods, which is the RMRs or the blood tests or the DEXA scans. We've got a whole team working with us on that.
Okay.
But so that's obviously all those three projects are with elite athletes.
Yeah.
But what the research is also showing is that it's really, these issues are really common among female exercisers who are going to the gym, training, carefully watching their diet, not quite getting enough energy in to cover what's going out, either accidentally or purposefully, right? They're trying to diet, trying to lose weight.
Yeah.
And so they actually can go into this LEA or red S state.
Are a lot of female athletes even aware of these conditions though?
Increasingly becoming aware, but when I first started researching this, no. And there's a lot of stigma around this, particularly in sporting cultures, when now we've got a lot of male coaches working with our top female athletes, and they don't want to talk about periods, and they don't want to talk about menstruation. They don't really want to talk about these things. So part of our sort of agenda we've had 3 national symposiums over the last few years where we're trying to get the coaches, the athletes, all the medical professionals, the researchers there as well, so we can actually start getting the dialogue going.
Yeah.
And I think it's starting to shift, and we're getting more traction in that, where athletes are increasingly aware. But yeah, there's still a lot of stigma.
Yeah, do you have any other methods of how to get the word out though?
Yeah, so it can't all be on me, right? We've got
yeah. But I'm not. When I say you, I'm talking about obviously the whole research field.
So High Performance Sport New Zealand, the lead medical doctor there, his name's Bruce Hamilton, and he came to our first symposium on this topic, and he knew it was an issue for our female athletes, and he also really recognised the value in what we're trying to lead, which is this multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah.
So he set up a couple of years ago this working group called WHISPER.
Okay.
Which is Healthy Women in Sport, a performance approach. The acronym has shifted around a little bit.
Right.
But we have a team of us that we meet 3 or 4 times a year, and we have endocrinologists, sports doctors, physiologists, sports scientists, myself as a sociologist. We have strength and conditioning coaches, physios, and so it's a very multidisciplinary group, and we're working together on one, understanding, like, what's the research base? What do we know? Where are the gaps? What do we need to do? And then how do we roll that out to raise awareness, to improve practice? And we've just had a survey across all of our elite carded athletes, female athletes in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And we're in the process of disseminating that data at the moment in terms of these issues. So we do, this is like the first time a country's ever had a full sweep, a full understanding of what's going on for the elite female athletes.
Yeah.
So we're in a pretty unique position to now start rolling out or suggesting some changes.
Okay. There's a bit of a controversial thing I want to ask you.
Okay.
Because I feel it's important to discuss. because obviously there are some people, so there might be a man that has a sex change or becomes a woman, and then they enter. So there was one in particular, there was a man that became a woman, then he entered Olympic weightlifting.
Yeah, Laura Hubbard's.
Yeah, and just totally destroyed the competition. Now, obviously, biologically, they're still a man, right? So how do you, because if I had a daughter and, and she trained for months and months and then she competed and then she lost, I feel like it's kind of it's unfair in some ways. But how is it something you tackle? Because, it's a very... It's a fine line.
Very controversial topic.
Yeah.
And
have you spoken to anyone or various groups about this and how to tackle it?
Yeah, this is a big topic in our Whisper group.
Yeah.
Because it's such a multidisciplinary group. We have some physiologists, etc., who are very much advocating that this is unfair. Transgender athletes have testosterone that they've been born with, which has created all these changes in the body that therefore even when they become a woman and they change the hormonal makeup, they've still got all those physical and physiological advantages. So it is unfair. As a sociologist, I've got to think about the ethics of that type of rationale, which for me, what is sport about?
Yeah.
Is it just about winning, or is it about...
For some people it is.
Yeah, but as society, we need to think about what is sport about, right? And if you tell these women who have had probably a pretty difficult life and a body that they do not feel is right for them, they go through this whole process of having this change happen. They're not doing it to cheat in sport, but they get treated as if they're trying to cheat. And...
yeah.
Then we're also telling them that they don't fit anywhere. They can't participate in women's sport, and they identify as women. So then they cannot participate in men's sport.
Could you have like a different?
That basically says that they can't participate anywhere.
And you'd have to make another.
Morally and ethically, I don't think that's what sport is about.
Yeah,
right.
But you know how let's use China as example. There are some very, very strict parents out there that they train their kids from a very young age and discipline them a lot. And let's say if they go to the Olympics or something and they don't win, there can be some serious repercussions for that, right? Yeah. So if they're competing against someone like a transgender person, then and they're disadvantaged, then it opens up a whole can of worms. So it seems like such a difficult task to manage.
Yeah, it really is a very complicated one that a lot of sports organisations around the world are trying to work through. And
I mean, it's hard. I can't see any answer. That's why it's like I wanted your opinion.
It's really controversial. It's really controversial, and
people try to apply a black and white thing to it, and it's not as simple as that.
But also, we need to think about the history of sport, right? And sport has basically was designed by men for men, based on the extremes of male bodies, and it's been like that since the ancient Greek sport.
Yeah.
And so over the last sort of 50 years, we've seen remarkable changes in women's sporting participation.
Yeah.
Where they've carved out space, they're increasingly being recognised, increasingly getting paid almost, decent salaries, some sports more so than others.
Yeah.
And we're seeing real changes, and that's happened because of female activism in terms of women leading in sport, women as athletes who are increasingly willing to speak out. We go back to like the Billie Jean King in tennis.
Yeah.
So when we come to this issue of transgender, it's in that context of sport being historically conceived as this male thing, this male preserve. And so, I think it's a real issue that we as a society need to think about is what is sport all about? And the Olympics, even them, the Olympic values are not just about the best, like who's the best. It's actually about values, social values, principles.
I think it is, but I think the media and other forms of media try to perceive it as how many medals can we win?
Of course. Yeah. But sport is never a fair or equal playing ground.
Oh, no, it's not.
One, we might think testosterone's this unfair advantage, which it may be physiologically, according to the physiologist.
Probably depends on the sport.
But we can't go all men are better than all women, right? It's a huge continuum of gender and ability and funding. Like if we're trying to get sport thinking about it as a fair and equal playing field, then one of the biggest advantages is funding in sport. If you come from a country that is throwing money at you, providing you with amazing facilities and resources and helps you travel the world to compete, etc., that's an unfair advantage to other countries who have no money, athletes who can't buy the latest swimming suit that helps you swim faster, or the latest technologies that help you. I mean, sport is never an equal playing field. And testosterone is just one part of this. So, yeah.
But people don't really realize that, though, do they? You make a very valid point with funding, you know. Let's take the All Blacks, for example.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of money is pumped into them than, say, other...
Well, let's not get on to funding in sport in New Zealand. You're going to get me into some trouble.
Okay.
Because, rugby is a big part of our culture in New Zealand, and it gets a lot of funding because they're very successful. And it's awesome to see some funding towards our female rugby players. But there are so many sports in New Zealand that are so underfunded, and real talent and amazing athletes, but they don't get just get a trickle of the funding.
Yeah. Well, the problem is you can't. There's just not a limitless amount of money. So you're limited in terms of how you can fund it. So you have to allocate it. But
who makes those allocations based on what? That's very controversial, Who
actually does make those decisions in terms of funding? I don't even know who.
So High Performance Sport New Zealand funds the different sports, and then those sports get funding based on their international achievements. And there's, I guess, a matrix of considerations in terms of the funding that I'm not probably the best expert to. Sometimes it's hard to get into those nitty-gritty details.
No, that's fair enough. So you're going to the Olympics next year. We talked about it briefly. You're going to Japan to do some research work, right?
Yeah, hopefully. So I've been working with my colleague, Associate Professor Belinda Wheaton at the University of Waikato, and we have been working. We had an IOC Advanced Research Program grant, so International Olympic Committee.
Yep.
And this was back in 2016 and 2017 when basically the IOC and the Tokyo 2020 Organising Committee had announced that 5 new sports would be shortlisted for inclusion in Tokyo. So
one of them was breakdancing, wasn't it?
No, that's for Paris.
Oh,
2024.
Yes.
So this was shortlisting, right, of surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing,
right,
baseball, softball, and karate. So these new sports were being shortlisted when our project started. And then more recently, they were, it was actually at the Rio Games that it was announced that they were being included. So in Tokyo next year, you'll see these 5 new sports.
Wow. Okay.
And a big part of this has happened with some major policy changes at the IOC level and what's called Agenda 2020, which has 40 different items where they're trying to revolutionize and change the Olympic model so that it becomes more flexible, it becomes more sustainable, environmentally sensitive. There's all these different 40 different items.
Okay.
And one of them is to be able to have the program to be a bit more flexible, because the changes in the program of the Olympics has been very, very hard to create change there. But the IOC recognises that they're losing younger viewers. So the average age of Olympic viewers is 55 years and greying, basically.
Really?
So this is lots of reasons for this, right? Young people aren't watching the Olympics anymore. They've got lots of other more important things to do. And they don't just sit down and watch TV for all day like we might once have done during the Olympics.
Because of social media and everything.
We might, get a YouTube clip.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, but we don't consume sports in the same ways that we used to.
Yeah, that's right.
And young people, they're at a competition for their attention. There's so many different varieties of things they might rather be doing, whether it's esports, whether it's skateboarding at the skate park, whatever it might be, right? And so the IOC is recognising that people aren't really tuning into a lot of the sports that we have had for a very long time. So how do we
was there a drop-off between 2016 and 2012? Like, what was the drop-off in terms of viewership?
Well, it's always complicated in terms of what country it's in, etc.
Right.
And I don't have those stats for you.
Yeah.
But it is...
Well, I know you wouldn't have the exact stats, but was it quite dramatic? Or is it like a slow
It's been a
thing?
slow decline. So what they've, things like the YouTube channel for the Olympic Games, they're really trying to move with the times with that.
Yeah.
And bringing these sports in as part of hopefully bringing young people back to these sports, back to the Olympics. So our research is really focusing on surfing, skateboarding and sport climbing because Belinda and I, we've been doing research on these sporting cultures for a long time.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history of these sports, they developed in the 70s and the 80s, often with quite countercultural, anti-establishment, do-it-yourself kind of philosophies. They were often developed in contrast to dominant jock sport cultures, parent cultures, strict coaches and hierarchies of sport. They were drawn to and developed these sports as something different.
Yeah.
And over time, we've seen a lot of change with the X Games and the increasing institutionalization, professionalization, commodification, commercialization of those sports, right? So now in these sports, there's very much competitive routes for athletes to become professional, well-paid athletes.
Yeah.
Where they travel the world as athletes. But when these sports were being discussed to go into the Olympics, there was quite a lot of controversy in these sporting cultures. Some of the athletes were like, I don't know if this is good for our sports. But the cultures more broadly, your sort of everyday recreational participants are like, surfing shouldn't be at the Olympics. A lot of skateboarders around the world were like, hell no. The Olympics is basically the sporting establishment. And we're an art form. We're about creativity and self-expression. When we get kind of squeezed into their model, what happens to our sport if we don't have any control over that? So we've, in our research, been really interested in that whole process of, okay, if these sports are going to go into the Olympics, what is the right way for that to happen so that skateboarders feel like they've got a voice, they've got some control over that, they don't feel like they're losing the autonomy of their sports. And in skateboarding in particular, it was really interesting because there were 3 different sports skateboarding organizations that wanted to be the ones leading it. There was
so they're all like fighting with each other to...
Yeah, quite a lot of friction. It's still a moving beast in that space. So
how is it decided what is even shortlisted in the first place? Do a whole bunch? Is there like a panel of people?
Many stages of that process. And in terms of the shortlisting, that was a decision between the Tokyo Organising Committee and the IOC. And I must say the IOC was working with us through that process with the research informing their discussion, that the IOC was sending out young people to surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing events, talking to the right people, talking to athletes, talking to industry organisers, talking to sponsors, trying to get a real sense of what does this mean for these sports, if we do this, how do we do it right? So actually the IOC was making a real effort. If we are going to do this, we need to do it the right way.
Yeah.
And our research was documenting all of that, and which is actually quite a significant shift from the IOC than what we've seen previously, where when they brought in these new sports like windsurfing in 1984, I think it was, and snowboarding in 1998, which was really controversial.
Yeah.
Because snowboarding got shoved in under the International Federation of Skiing, and they had no control over that process. And there were a lot of snowboarders at the time who were like, no way.
Yeah.
We're not going to the Olympics. We're absolutely protesting that. And there was basically the world's best snowboarder at the time, Norwegian Turgeir Haakonsen, who was very political and outspoken and really critical of the IOC and what the Olympics means for snowboarding. And so when we see these sports, these new ones, the IOC working through a different model of trying to work with them, trying to understand if we're going to do this, how do we do it right? Quite significant differences and changes in approach. That's been really interesting to witness and document. And then more recently, FIG, the International Federation of Gymnastics, they've been trying to kind of do that old model where they've been trying to bring in parkour. And the whole parkour community around the world has been like, we're not gymnastics. We actually have our organising bodies, and we want to, if this happens, we should be the ones managing this process. So in a way, it's kind of gone back to the old model. So maybe it's not such signs of progress.
The more sports you bring in, does the more convoluted it get? Does the more complex it get?
Yeah, so the IOC have a cap on how many sports, how many events they can have as part of an Olympic program. And so when they bring new sports in, old sports have to go out, which gets... So with bringing in like these new sports, what are some of the older sports that didn't necessarily happen with these ones, because it's a new thing where host countries are able to apply to have new sports coming in.
Is this a trial or is this a permanent thing?
This is a trial for Tokyo. And LA's the next one, and they have the option to keep those sports or not.
Right.
This is kind of the Agenda 2020 shifting in the program.
Yeah.
And this is where Paris, which is the next Summer Olympics, that's 2024.
Yep.
They're bringing in breakdancing.
Yeah, when you said that at the public lecture,
and
I was
they're keeping
like,
surfing, and they're keeping skateboarding, and they're keeping sport climbing.
Yeah. I find breakdancing interesting because it's more dancing as opposed to a sport, I would think.
Very interesting. It's a
then,
sporting, cultural, artistic form that I'm not an expert on, so I won't dare to comment.
Because obviously I would think that might open the floodgates for, other types of dancing.
Yeah, I mean, they have within that sport, they have all their rules and regulations, and it's in because it meets very strict criteria of what the IOC have to become an Olympic sport. And
you don't happen to know what that criteria is? Not offhand.
Yeah, but it has to be truly an international sport. They have to have regular competitions. They have to have it has to be a fully structured international organization that oversees, so you can't just have a sport like a sport that's only in a country or in a small group of countries. It's really popular in a small group of countries. You couldn't put that into the Olympics because it wouldn't be globally a global sport.
What's defined as global though?
I think it has to be participated in all continents.
All continents?
Something like that.
Okay. Don't quote
me on that. But, so I initially was like, breaking, that's so strange, but I'd actually at the, when I was in Buenos Aires last year for the Olympism in Action Forum, that was during the Youth Olympic Games. And so I went along with a group of us, with the IOC to witness what they were doing in their urban park, which is another area where with these sports, they're trying to change the feel and vibe and representation of the Olympics. So it was free to get in. You brought us, you'd registered, and once that had all sold out, you brought a skateboard in, you could still get in. So they've got the skate park over here, they've got the climbing wall over there, they've got the break dancing there, they've got live music here. People flow in between these events. There's a real festival vibe about it. There's some graffiti happening over here. They're really trying to tap into that festival vibe, and that's definitely what we're going to see in Tokyo. And just recently, I think it's in Budapest, they had the World Urban Games, which is parkour and skateboarding and BMX and inline skating. And again, the IOC is trying to respond to these trends of creating this festival environment. And there's lots of considerations that they've taken on board in terms of why they're going this direction. One of them is, losing younger viewers, but also that whole festival environment. Supposedly the research shows that it translates much better into audience participation. So they're really trying to break down that divide of people sitting in stadiums watching sport to actually being amongst it, standing right there from an athlete, having a go yourself. Basketball 3-on-3 is being brought in as well.
Okay.
So they're really trying to make sport more accessible, break down these kinds of divides, which it's pretty interesting things to be witnessing.
Yeah, I suppose year to year you must see so many changes.
I think it's accelerating right now.
Have you witnessed over the last year any new sports that have been created? Or even the last few years?
New sports.
Or like or something that could potentially evolve into a sport?
I don't know. There's always new modifications going on.
Something popping up. Yeah. So when you if you do go to Tokyo, what specifically will you be doing there? Will you be on the ground? Or?
Yeah, so Belinda and I, the ideal, depending on funding, would be that we were at the surfing, skateboarding and sport climbing events.
Right.
We'd be very keen to, so we've got a book that will be published shortly after the Olympics. So the plan is to, because we've been researching this for years now, to have the book ready to go except for the final chapter, which the final chapter will be what we witness in Tokyo. Mm-hmm. To publish it before then, the story's not finished, right? So what actually happens with these sports? We're very keen to do interviews with the people who've been involved in the process of getting them there, how their reflections on how they felt it went, was it what they hoped it would be, some of the things that they didn't kind of turn out the way they hoped it would. Mm-hmm. But we're also really interested in this, the idea of bringing these sports in is that brings back younger viewers and has a different sort of audience engagement with sports at the Olympics. So the idea will be to see how the Japanese and international audiences engage with these sports.
Because I would imagine where the Olympics is held will play a big part in the viewership as well, particularly with cultures, because you know how Japanese have certain things that they're into, and then, you know, in France they'll have different things that they're into, and that all affects viewership. Is it always, do you know if it's the highest turnout of viewership is in the country where it's held, usually? Or like there's like a huge increase in that particular country?
Of viewership?
Yeah. Like say because the Olympics is being held in Japan this year.
Yeah.
There would be a huge...
Next year.
Sorry. In terms of it being viewed, do you think it'll be viewed more than, say, it was in 2000?
If it wasn't being hosted there, would they? I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure there.
Would you like to see the Olympics held here one day in New Zealand?
No.
I mean, I don't think... No? Do you think it will ever happen?
There is so much controversy around the world with bringing the Olympics to
any country.
Cities.
Yeah.
And, you know, host cities, when their cities get shortlisted, there's massive protests around this.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. So in Rio and even in Vancouver with the Winter Olympics in 2010, because in terms of taxpayer dollars, and, you know, if you're in countries where there's a lot of money gets spent on building massive facilities and all of that.
That might only be used once too.
Exactly. And is that the best use of taxpayer dollars? Whether it might be housing when communities have nowhere to sleep, or, you know, is that the best use of taxpayer dollars? And so we're seeing a lot of concerns. And this is part of the issue for the IOC in terms of making the Olympics more affordable and sustainable
how would you
for
even
host
do that?
cities. Yeah.
How would you even do that, especially if you're bringing in more sports and you're trying to, because usually with these things, how it works is every year or every 4 years in this case, it has to get bigger. It has to be better.
Yeah.
You know, so you end up spending more money usually.
Yeah, well, that's part of bringing these new sports in is trying to move towards that more sustainable model, right? So with the skateboarding and the sport climbing, these are not big venues that you need to build, and actually the idea is that this will be in this urban kind of environment for those sports, and then they can break down those climbing walls or break down that park and donate it to a community, or it becomes it's actually not having to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on building a big new venue. They're actually much more affordable sporting.
Does most of the money just go to actually building the venue or the facilities?
It's a big part of it, but also you've got all the transport issues.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in Tokyo in December last year, and I went to the Tokyo Organising Committee up on the 20th floor, and they've got 100 staff up there who've been working for 4 years, and they're pointing out the big new venue for these sports, and, you know, all the transport issues of moving huge populations safely to and between venues. Huge logistical nightmares for any host city.
I bet. Now I know you've done some research with people after natural disasters or some type of accident. So you were involved with Christchurch after the earthquake.
Yeah. So I did research with people who had been affected by the Christchurch earthquakes, and I was particularly interested in talking to those people who were active sporting participants before the earthquake. So whether it was in these alternative sports, these kind of lifestyle sports. So surfers, climbers, skateboarders, mountain bikers, where they're not athletes, but there's a very much part of why they choose to live where they live, a big part of their kind of daily or weekly routines. Often doing these sports helps them connect with their kind of community through. And so when the earthquakes happened, obviously people were immediately focused on the health of themselves and their family, getting their houses sorted, finding somewhere to be safe for their families and their nearest and dearest. But after, you know, a few weeks, a few months passed, so many of them realized that they're trying to get a sense of normalcy or something familiar, trying to get life back on track. And for many of them, they noticed a big thing was missing was their physical activity, the sports that they do. So across more traditional organised sports, same thing. The venues, football fields, swimming, you know, all of these were damaged and destroyed. So people were not able to, you know, even going for a walk. Some of these places were really polluted, air pollution, for example. for people who loved walking along the beach or going for surfing, the beaches were closed for 9 months because of the raw sewage being pumped out into the ocean.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that long.
And then all those people who would love mountain biking or walking along the Port Hills, they all, or climbing, so many climbing tracks and mountain biking tracks were destroyed forever.
Yeah.
So actually a lot of people who were passionate about these sports and get through these sports really gained a sense of connection to their place that they live. It really rattled, obviously, physically the earth, but also the things that hold their life together, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them really mourned the loss of these places. And what I witnessed was through the research, people seeking out alternatives to really try to do these sports again, to help them cope and process with what was going on around them, often quite stressful home lives, etc. So skaters... they took to the streets and they actually quite enjoyed all the broken, changed environment. Obviously, their downtown was red zones. They lost a lot of their favourite skating spots. But there's some pretty amazing footage of these guys, and they were mostly guys, skating in these very, torn up parts of the city. Some of them found these broken down, closed off places that were set out for being demolished, warehouses. And they'd go in there and the community all the skaters would gather and come to these indoor warehouses and they'd build skate ramps and areas of steps to drop off and they'd gather and be together and participate in the sport that they love. Whereas the surfers, the climbers, they'd be texting their friends to carpool out. So the climbers would go out to the bouldering sites inland and so Castle Hill, and then the surfers would, because it's expensive, they'd have to drive an hour north or an hour south to get to unpolluted surfing beaches when the surf was good.
Yeah.
And so that'd be a whole day away. But they talked about how doing these sports again helped them deal with their stress, helped them make sense of their lives, kind of regain some of the rhythms, and also, the social connections through these sports, being with their friends. Some of the older participants of these sports really expressed some anxieties of traveling away from their families. If something happens again, they're too far away.
Yeah.
So they carry this new anxiety with them.
How long did this go on? Like, how long were you there for? When you were doing
I
this
just went
research?
in there and I was there for a week and just did all these interviews, basically. But then the research took an interesting turn when I was focusing on a particular case of Sumner. And the Sumner community, they obviously lost a bunch of the beautiful trails and they had a lot of damage in that area and the kids were left with nothing to do. So a lot of these kids got together with some parents and set up a little mini skate ramp in the downtown sort of village. So the kids would all get together and have fun. Often they'd go home and the parents are stressed about insurance and school and work, and this is a place where they could go and just play. And that's a really important thing in these types of environments of high stress and disaster. So then what I was very interested to see is Levi Strauss offered $180,000 to build a skate park on the boardwalk, on the water there, the waterfront. And so the whole community was like, yeah, because, the council couldn't just build skate parks everywhere. Yeah. So here's a transnational corporation offering a skate park. But there was a lot of people who owned waterfront properties, very, very, very expensive waterfront properties, who were like, no way, not a skate park in front of my house. Yeah. So there's a real clash in this community in terms of what does this rebuilding process look like? And
there's the rebuilding's still going on now.
Oh, of course it is.
I was there recently, and
it's going to go on for a lot longer.
Yeah.
But I've been really focused in on around what this skate park issue brought up, because it was all of these broader issues. And so I went down to various big community meetings. And one of them, there were over 200 people, young people, making statements, the house owners making statements. And it was very emotional. And in the end, Levi Strauss pulled their funding because the landowners had made it so difficult, and they have such great funding. They could choose to find the best lawyers, and very interesting, the politics of rebuilding.
Oh, yeah. Well, politics in general is just...
Yeah, it's just a microcosm. It's just a little case study, and the role of sport in that and community.
Yeah. Oh, wow. This has been very informative.
We've covered a lot of terrain here.
We have. Is there any place, any particular country that you've gone to, which or a country that you haven't been to, or a city you haven't been to that you'd really like to go and do some research?
Do research?
Yeah.
I'm more and more interested in New Zealand, actually.
New Zealand? That's cool.
Yeah, I started off and I was more interested in what was happening in the rest of the world. And now in my career at this point, I'm more and more interested in understanding what's happening in our own communities and developing methodologies and collaborations to understand what's going on in our own backyard, because I think it's fascinating and the world needs to know.
Yeah, I think slowly people are learning about New Zealand and how much we can offer, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've definitely been put on the international stage.
Definitely.
We definitely have a lot of sporting athletes that are really, really good. And we've always been the underdogs, I feel.
Yeah, and research-wise, we've got some massive gaps.
Such as?
Oh, like the project I mentioned before, Muslim girls and women in sport. Yeah. Like, there's just nothing in that area, and there's very little in terms of Pacifica people's experience of sport, or so there's huge gaps here.
Well, I just saw the stats for the 2018 census. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit of an eye opener in terms of how small a lot of these minorities are, and how probably they in terms of the population size and how scattered they are, because obviously New Zealand European seems to be the dominant. Yeah,
but wasn't there a lot of politics around the census actually not getting out to a lot of these communities?
I think so. And I think, I don't know how accurate it is. I went on the website and they stated all these reasons of how they filled in the gaps. So I don't know how accurate it is. But even so, obviously there is a lot of minorities, a lot of groups here that probably don't get the funding that they need in terms of their sporting facilities and other facilities. So it's I agree. And as a researcher working with organisations like Sport New Zealand, we've got it's a collaborative project on the Muslim girls and women's participation in sport, because really they recognise gaps in knowledge. Well, they're more aware probably because they're there, they're on the ground, they know.
Yeah, but just because we don't know, sometimes it's hard to know how we should know. So
well, that's right.
And then how do we do that research? And then not just do the research and publish it in a journal here, but actually make sure that research then translates into policy and into informing the people that actually
because the
are working on the grassroots
part
level.
Of the problem is, like, if you do all this research and then you're trying to get it out to the people, sometimes people just want everything in sound bites and snippets. So to try and condense all of your research to say, well, this is the conclusion we reached, and sum it up in one sentence would be incredibly frustrating, I assume.
Yeah, so a lot of for me doing research, if we're not finding a way to translate it to sports organisations or down to the community level where it's actually having an impact, I'm not sure what the point of it is, other than contributing to knowledge on these journals that a few people might read. So that's something I've been really working hard at the international level with the IOC, with Sport New Zealand, with High Performance Sport New Zealand, to making sure that the research does inform. Yes, because often as academics we have language that we don't realise is a language that not everybody understands, right?
Yeah.
So how do we translate our findings? And so we publish, and often there's lots of theory and dense language, but when we're communicating or translating that to a sports organisation, they just need the usable stuff.
Yeah.
So how do we actually do that research in the academic journals, etc., as well as having conversations with those people involved in organisations, etc. And I think there's a big kind of divide that needs to go two ways, and we're working on that.
Yeah, well, it's always ongoing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's good. You learn both. I think we learn a lot about some of our assumptions in our research, some of the things that we just kind of take for granted, what's actually usable knowledge.
Do you get frustrated though if you see like misinformation that's getting put out there? Because you know how like anyone can just post anything on the internet and it's somehow a valid source. And it's getting to the point where it's very hard to determine what is fact and what is fiction.
We did that with our first year students, right? Like, what's a legitimate source? How do you know? Yeah.
So in terms of, what do you make them do? Do you make them go online?
Well,
and
I think it's about starting with awareness that there's lots of different sources of information out there, and some of them have been through different processes of the research behind it, the vetting process. Like for something to appear in an academic journal, it's gone through sometimes longer than a year processes of blind review. So it's very rigorous, right? In terms of a lot of stuff's been critiqued and challenged before it even ends up in a journal. Yeah. Versus something that's been posted that's getting lots and lots of likes or lots and lots of retweets or whatever it is. Does that make it more legitimate knowledge? And it might just be someone just spouting off something that they've worked well for them in their nutrition or whatever.
Well, that's what happens sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes people think what's popular is truthful. Yeah. Yeah.
So we work with our students to make sure that they can identify there's lots of different sources of knowledge out there, and then
is it like a test?
Some are more credible than others.
So is it like a test that you do on them?
It's not a test, it's a sort of it's an activity.
Just an informative way of, okay, this is what to look out for.
Yeah.
So what are some of the ways that you pick up on stuff not being fact? What would be some of the ways? So let's say if I was going online and I was trying to find some information on, I don't know, research on skateboarding or something. Yeah. How would I determine what is false and what is
true?
Well,
you consider the source.
Yeah, obviously that's the first one.
All right. So is it a
Wikipedia,
or is it a journal article, or is it a skate magazine, or is it someone's blog? And actually, if you know the source, you can and you get a sense of who's produced it and for what reasons. Doesn't make it not helpful, but you know that it's come from a particular opinion versus an extensive multi-year long sort of process of developing that knowledge across lots of different people. Yeah. So one person's opinion versus, extensive kind of research. And it's not to say necessarily that one is better than another, but to know the source, to know the motivations, to know where it's come from, who produced it.
So what would be if I was trying to find some information or research on sports, what would be some good sources in terms of websites? What's some websites you would recommend for getting
Well, it depends what you're looking for. But
is there anything in terms of like a general overview?
Yeah, so if you go to something like Sport New Zealand website, they have a lot of their reports, whether it's youth sport or whether it's, mapping across the Sport New Zealand, where they have kind of like a census or a big survey, which is pretty extensive and pretty rigorous. Okay. But then you've got, the academics across the country who are working in the space, whether it's sports science, sports psychology, sports sociology, sport history. I mean, we've got a bunch of academics working in that space, so there's different journals. Yeah, and then some sports organisations themselves are doing their own research in-house. So,
okay, I'll have to keep that in mind, because this is part of the problem I find when I'm looking at stuff online. I'm like, is this real? Is this fake? I don't know.
Well, it's good that you're asking that question. Yeah.
Yeah. I go on Reddit quite a bit, and they often have subreddits for different. So say, for example, there's a subreddit on world news or a subreddit on futurology or something, and they'll have like articles or all the stuff that, news. And then I'm looking at it sometimes, and I'm like, is this real or not? Sometimes I have to sift through the comments because people have probably already worked out whether it's fake or not. Which is good.
You're not the first one asking those questions.
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of misinformation that's getting put out there, on the world stage. Some political leaders are getting advised by people that are, providing misinformation. So it's, and it's easy for people
we're in the times of fake news.
Yeah. Well, that's right.
A site that I really enjoy is called The Conversation, and that is it's an international organisation, but it's basically, how do they call it? It's like academic rigor with journalistic flair, something like that's their byline. So it's basically academics who do year-long, multi-year, career-based research, but they are presenting it as quite short. Right. And really written for everyday audiences, but with links to the legitimate research, and it's rigorously kind of processed by the editorial team at The Conversation. So it kind of makes the latest research accessible to mainstream audiences.
That's good.
Yeah,
okay,
it's
I'll
pretty
have to check
cool
it out.
actually. Yeah.
The Conversation, it's
The
called.
Conversation.
Okay, well, good. Okay, I'll have to check that out. Cool. All right. Well, hey, I might wrap up there unless there's anything specifically that you want to talk about.
Thanks, that was fun. I think hopefully you get a sense of what a sociologist of sport does.
Hey, if Tokyo happens and stuff, and you do end up going there, and it's you were saying it's pretty costly there during the Olympic World Games.
Yep.
So if it does happen, feel free to come back on at any point in time and tell me all about your research.
Yeah,
and stuff.
I'm sure it's going to be pretty fascinating thing to witness.
Yeah. I've never been to Japan. I've been wanting to go to Japan for years, and I was hoping to go next year, but it's going to be too expensive. So I might just wait until all of that with the Olympic Games is over. Yeah, and then go from there. But hey, thank you. Thank you
My
so
pleasure.
much.
Thanks for having me along.
All right, that's the show, guys. Until next time, stay safe. See ya.